The Fourth Crusade, a tragedy of greed, betrayal, and the shattering of Christendom. The story begins not with a clash of armies but with whispers in candlelit chambers where powerful men made decisions that would echo through centuries. In the year 1198, as winter gripped Europe, Pope Innocent III, a man of formidable intellect and unshakable conviction, dreamed of restoring Christian control over Jerusalem. His call for a new crusade spread across kingdoms and duchies, stirring the hearts of knights and nobles alike. But this holy mission would soon twist into something far darker, its path warped by human ambition until it turned against Christendom itself. The air in Venice smelled of salt and ambition in the spring of 1201 when the French envoys arrived. They came seeking transport for an army of God, but found instead the calculating gaze of Doge Enrico Dandolo, a man nearing 90 but with a mind sharper than any sword in Christendom. The negotiations that followed would become a masterclass in political manipulation. Dandolo, his blind eyes seeing more than most men's, recognized the Crusaders' desperation and named his price 85,000 silver marks and half of all conquests. The Franks, drunk on religious fervor, agreed without realizing they had just mortgaged their crusade to Venetian merchants. As months passed, the reality of their predicament became clear. The crusading host gathering at Venice numbered far fewer than expected, their coffers woefully inadequate. The Venetians, having suspended their entire commercial enterprise to build this fleet, would not be denied payment. Tensions rose like the Adriatic tides until one fateful day when Dandolo proposed an alternative. The Crusaders could work off their debt by helping Venice reclaim Zara, a rebellious city on the Dalmatian coast. Never mind that Zara was a Christian city, never mind that attacking it violated every principle of their holy mission. Survival, not piety, now drove their decisions. The Siege of Zara in November 1202 marked the moment the Fourth Crusade lost its soul. When citizens hung crosses from the walls to show their shared faith, some crusaders wept at what they were ordered to do. Yet they attacked anyway, their weapons turning against fellow Christians while Venetian galleys blockaded the harbor. The city fell after brief resistance, its treasures looted, its people left to shiver in the ruins as winter set in. Pope Innocent, upon hearing the news, flew into a rage that shook the Vatican, but his excommunication of the Venetians meant little to men already damned by their actions. Then came the stranger from the east, young Alexios Angelos, his fine clothes worn from travel, his eyes burning with desperate ambition. His tale of betrayal and exile, of an uncle who had stolen the Byzantine throne, ignited new hopes among the Crusader leaders. Here was their salvation: help Alexios reclaim his birthright, and in return he would pay their debts to Venice, supply troops for the Holy Land, and reunite the Eastern Church with Rome. The offer glittered like the gold mosaics of Constantinople, blinding them to its perils. When the combined fleet appeared before Constantinople in June 1203, even battle-hardened knights gasped at the sight. The mighty Theodosian walls, unbreached for nearly 900 years, stretched as far as the eye could see. The golden domes of 1,000 churches shimmered in the sunlight, while the great gilded statue of Justinian atop his column seemed to watch their approach with divine judgment. The Byzantines, seeing this unexpected armada, scrambled to prepare defenses even as confusion reigned in the palace. The first assault nearly failed until a reckless charge led by none other than the blind Dandolo himself turned the tide. The old Doge, standing fully armored on the prow of his galley, demanded to be set ashore or he would leap into the sea. His Venetians, shamed by their leader's courage, fought like demons to establish a foothold beneath the walls. By sundown, the Crusaders controlled a section of the city's defenses, and Emperor Alexios III, the usurper, fled in the night like a thief, taking the imperial treasury with him. The young pretender was crowned Alexios IV, but his reign proved brief and disastrous. The promised payments to the Crusaders drained the treasury, while his attempts to force union with Rome alienated both clergy and people. As winter deepened, so did the discontent in Constantinople's streets. Taverns buzzed with rumors of betrayal, churches echoed with denunciations of the Latin heretics, and the great forums filled with angry mobs. When a nobleman named Alexios Doukas overthrew and strangled the young emperor, the new regime made its position clear: the Crusaders would get no more gold, and must leave Byzantine territory at once. What followed in April 1204 was not war but slaughter, not conquest but desecration. The Crusaders, furious at being cheated of their payment, attacked Constantinople with a brutality that shocked even their own chroniclers. For 3 days the nightmare continued, nuns raped in their convents, libraries that had stood since antiquity put to the torch, holy relics tossed about like tavern dice. The great Hagia Sophia suffered worst of all, its altar smashed by drunken knights who set up a whore to mock the patriarch's throne. The bronze statues of ancient Greece and Rome, preserved for centuries, were melted down for coin. Priceless manuscripts burned to heat the invaders' camps, while the famed 4 bronze horses of the Hippodrome were hauled away to adorn St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. When the smoke cleared, the Crusaders established the so-called Latin Empire, a bastard state that would limp along for 57 years amidst constant rebellion. The true Byzantine government fled to Nicaea, its leaders nursing an enduring hatred for the West that would shape history for centuries to come. As for the Holy Land, it remained in Muslim hands, untouched by this crusade that had lost its way. The deeper tragedy unfolded in the decades that followed. The Byzantine Empire, though eventually restored, never recovered its former strength. The schism between Eastern and Western Christianity became unbridgeable. And when the Ottomans came knocking in 1453, there was no united Christendom to stand against them, only bitter memories of how Crusaders had once raped the Queen of Cities. Perhaps the most haunting legacy lies in the story of the Crusaders themselves. Many died far from home, their great vows unfulfilled. Others returned wealthy from loot but poor in honor, their tales of Constantinople's riches inspiring more greed than piety. The few who reached Jerusalem did so as pilgrims, not conquerors, their weapons left behind along with their illusions. In the end, the Fourth Crusade stands as history's starkest warning that even the noblest cause, when mixed with human ambition and greed, can produce the most terrible betrayals. The Crusaders set out to reclaim Christ's tomb but instead ravaged Christ's people. They sought to unite Christendom but left it fractured beyond repair. Their story reminds us that the road to hell is often paved with the best intentions, and that no banner, no matter how holy, can sanctify the sins committed beneath it. The ruins of Constantinople's greatness, the empty pedestals where ancient treasures once stood, the faded frescoes of churches that would never be restored, all these stand as silent witnesses to that terrible truth. For in their hunger for earthly gold, the men of the Fourth Crusade lost something far more precious, their very souls. And in doing so, they doomed generations yet unborn to pay the price for their sins. Such is the way of history. Our greatest failures often outlive our grandest triumphs, and the wounds we inflict upon the world sometimes never heal. The Fourth Crusade proved this with brutal clarity, leaving behind not glory but ashes, not unity but division, not faith but cynicism. Its legacy is a warning carved in fire and blood across the pages of time, that when holy war becomes mere robbery dressed in sacred vestments, everyone loses, and God himself weeps. The sack that shook the world in April 1204, the Crusaders decided to take by force what they had been promised. They stormed the walls and fell upon the city like wolves. They spared neither church nor marketplace, neither priest nor merchant. They looted the Hagia Sophia, stole gold and relics, and defiled altars. It was said that some knights seated prostitutes on the patriarch's throne and drank wine from holy chalices. Others stole even the golden horses from the Hippodrome, carrying them back to Venice, where they still stand today atop St. Mark's Basilica. The fall of an empire and the birth of darkness. With the fall of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire, the last bastion of Christianity in the East, collapsed. The Crusaders established the Latin Empire, a feeble state ruled by iron and fire, while the Byzantines fled to Nicaea, carrying with them the seeds of hatred that would make them reject any Western aid even when the Ottomans stood at their gates 2 centuries later. And Jerusalem, no one ever reached it. Epilogue. When the cross betrayed itself in the end, the Fourth Crusade was nothing but a poem of human greed. The Crusaders, who were supposed to be defenders of the faith, became mere brigands. The Pope, who had condemned them, accepted the outcome when he saw an opportunity to subjugate the Eastern Church, but the price was higher than anyone had imagined. For centuries later, when the Ottomans besieged Constantinople again in 1453, there was no one left to save it, because the Crusaders had already destroyed it. And so, history wrote in the blood of Constantinople a lesson that would never be forgotten: when faith becomes a commodity, even the greatest victories turn into unforgivable defeats. Destruction under the banner of the cross. The complete saga of the Fourth Crusade in the shadowy Lateran Palace where the spirits of popes drifted between marble columns, Innocent III sat alone in his private chamber. The golden altar candles cast flickering shadows across his pale face as his trembling hands held the letter from the east. News of desecrated holy sites in Jerusalem, of Christian pilgrims dragged by their hair through the streets of the holy city, of churches converted to mosques and images of Christ trampled under invaders' feet. He clutched his golden cross until it hurt, his blue eyes burning with holy fire. "This shall not stand," he whispered hoarsely. "Infidels shall not rule the land of Christ." Winds of change were sweeping through Europe in those days. In the castles of France and Germany, knights trained for combat from dawn. In monasteries, monks copied ancient manuscripts and prayed for the salvation of souls. In marketplaces, merchants exchanged news of the new campaign that would liberate Jerusalem from infidel clutches. But none knew this crusade would become the worst betrayal in Christian history. The next morning, cardinals gathered in the Grand Chapel. Innocent III stood before them like the prophet Jeremiah, his voice rising and falling like stormy waves. "Shepherds of Christ, the world has slept while infidel feet defile the holiest of lands." His words pierced hearts like swords. "The Lord looks upon us today as he once gazed upon Moses from the burning bush." Innocent III was no ordinary pope. He was a genius in every sense. Graduating from the University of Paris before 20, mastering canon law to his teacher's astonishment, he had climbed the church hierarchy like a soaring arrow. Now, as undisputed master of Catholicism, he was determined to write history with an iron hand. In noble castles across Europe, papal envoys knocked on doors bearing the supreme pontiff's summons. "The cross calls you." This cry echoed in every town square and village. In Champagne Castle, Count Theobald III lay on his deathbed when he heard the call. "Take up my cross," he ordered his servants, handing the banner to his nephew. In Flanders, Baldwin IX left behind his wife and 2 young daughters, swearing upon the gospel to return victorious or martyred, but fate was weaving other threads into this epic. In the floating city of Venice, where palaces rose from water like dreams, the blind Doge Enrico Dandolo sat in his secret council. 90 years of experience had made him a living legend, though his eyes no longer saw light. "They will come to us," he rasped to his advisors. "They will come with all their religious zeal and all their naivety. And they'll find no ships but ours." When Crusader nobles arrived in Venice summer 1202, they were dazzled by Dandolo's reception. Lavish banquets in the Doge's palace featured golden plates bearing foods they'd never tasted. But behind this apparent generosity, Venetian minds calculated. 84,000 silver marks, the price demanded for the fleet. An unimaginable sum. The Crusaders had barely gathered half-dot on a moonlit September night. Crusade leaders met secretly. "The Venetians have betrayed us," cried a knight. But the blind Doge had another solution. "There's a rebellious city called Zara," he said, running fingers over a leather map. "Help us subdue it, and we'll discuss your debt later." Zara was a Catholic Christian city. But necessity knows no law. When the massive fleet appeared off Zara's coast, citizens were stunned. From the walls, they raised crosses and Bibles, screaming, "We are your brothers in faith." But the first volleys had already been fired. The roar of catapults mixed with women and children's screams. Within 5 days, the city fell, its men having defended valiantly. The Crusaders looted their own churches before realizing their horror. In Rome, when news arrived, Innocent III erupted in fury. "Cursed be those raising swords against Christian brothers," he wrote angrily. But the curse came too late. The Crusaders had passed the point of no return. Then came the story's great twist. On Corfu Island, a handsome young man in tattered robes appeared, Prince Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Byzantine Emperor. "Help me reclaim my throne," he begged Crusader leaders, "and I'll make your empire the world's richest." Golden promises, 200,000 silver marks, a 30,000-strong army to aid Jerusalem's conquest, and Eastern Church reunion with Rome. In Constantinople, the frightened empress moved through palaces like a shadow. "The Latins are coming," whispered markets and churches. When the enormous Crusader fleet appeared on the horizon, Byzantines gasped at a sight unseen for centuries, hundreds of ships covering the Sea of Marmara like locusts. The siege lasted months. One decisive night, blind Doge Dandolo, now 90, ordered his men to raise his shield on the flagship's mast. "Either I plant St. Mark's banner on those walls today, or die trying," he roared. Inspired by their leader's courage, Venetian soldiers stormed walls like a tidal wave. Constantinople fell July 17, 1203. But joy was brief. Young Prince Alexios, now Emperor Alexios IV, failed to gather promised gold. The great city became a powder keg. In a deserted palace, Alexios V strangled the young emperor and threw his body into the Sea.By April 1204, Crusaders reached the point of no return. "Take what's yours," commanders shouted. They burst into the great city like ravenous beasts. They looted Hagia Sophia, tearing the holy veil with teeth. They stole saints' relics, loading them onto donkeys. In streets, priests and monks' corpses rotted under sun while knights drank wine from sacred chalices. When catastrophe news reached Innocent III, he collapsed in his chamber. He had sought to unite Christendom, instead tore it apart. He aimed to liberate Jerusalem, instead lost the entire East. 20 years later, a Franciscan monk wandered Constantinople's ruined streets. He saw a small child playing with bones in church rubble. "What are you doing, my son?" he asked. The child looked up wide-eyed. "I'm playing Crusaders." The bones were dead dogs. Thus ended the grand dream, not in holy triumph but betrayal, greed, and a child's laughter, no longer distinguishing heroes from beasts. The great Constantinople would never be the same, nor would Crusaders remain heroes in anyone's eyes. The Fourth Crusade became a generational warning, a lesson in how greed can twist noblest principles into excuses for vilest crimes. In distant monasteries, monks recorded these events in chronicles, praying forgiveness for those who defiled Christ's name under the cross's banner. In the East, Muslims watched amazed as Christians turned on each other, as enemies did to them what they couldn't do themselves. Jerusalem, the Crusades' proclaimed goal, remained in Muslim hands, awaiting other campaigns, other wars, other victims. But one thing was certain, the world would never view Crusades the same. The Fourth Crusade revealed Holy War's ugly face, where religious pretexts became mere masks for political ambitions and personal greed. Ultimately, no one won this story. Not the Pope who wanted Christian unity, not the Crusaders who sold souls to Venice, not even Venetians who gained spoils but lost humanity. The only victors were those seeing this tragedy's lesson, who understood that any war, however justified, produces only ruin. Thus the Fourth Crusade became a cautionary legend, a tale mothers tell children on dark nights, reminding them that evil sometimes comes wearing virtue's mask, that greatest betrayals can occur under banners of holiest principles. The Shadow of the Lion and Venice, the epic of the great betrayal. The golden morning sun cast its shimmering rays upon the glittering canals of Venice as the Council of Ten gathered on that fateful morning. Doge Enrico Dandolo, the blind old man who ruled the merchant republic with an iron fist, sat in silence while his advisors eagerly debated the offer from Rome. "They want a fleet to transport their army to the east," whispered one advisor. Dandolo did not smile, but his sightless eyes seemed to gaze at something far in the distance. "We will give them what they want," he rasped, "but not in the way they expect." In another palace miles away, Pope Innocent III wrote his letters in golden ink, calling the kings of Europe to join the Fourth Crusade. He envisioned a mighty army crossing the sea to liberate Jerusalem from the infidels. But he did not know that his ships would carry an army to a completely different fate. A wave of religious fervor swept through Europe. In the castles of France, knights trained diligently. In the monasteries, monks prayed day and night. In the ports, merchants calculated profits and losses. No one knew that this crusade would turn from a holy march into a journey through the corridors of betrayal and greed. The Crusader nobles arrived in Venice in the summer of 1202, and the first surprise awaited them. 84,000 silver marks? Count Baldwin IX exclaimed in disbelief. This was the price the Venetians demanded for the fleet, a fantastical sum enough to buy an entire city. "This is impossible." But the blind Dandolo knew they had no other choice. On a moonlit night, the crusade leaders gathered in a secret chamber beneath the Doge's palace. "We have been deceived," one knight said angrily. Venice wants to enslave us with debts we cannot repay. But Dandolo suddenly entered the room, as if he knew exactly what was on their minds. There is a solution, said the cunning old man calmly. The rebellious city of Zara. Help us bring it back under Venetian rule, and we will reconsider your debt. It was a devil's bargain. Zara was a Catholic city like their own, governed by Christians like themselves. But necessity knows no law, and hunger knows no religious restraint. When the massive fleet appeared off the coast of Zara, the citizens raised crosses on the walls, crying, "We are your brothers in faith." But the first arrows had already been loosed. In Rome, news reached Pope Innocent III. "May God curse those who raise their swords against their Christian brothers," he wrote in an angry letter. But the curse arrived too late. Blood had already been spilled, and the line had been crossed. The Crusaders had now become mercenaries in Venice's service. Then came the biggest surprise of all. On the island of Corfu, a handsome young man in tattered clothes appeared, Prince Alexios Angelos, the deposed son of the Byzantine Emperor. "Help me reclaim my throne," he pleaded with the Crusader leaders, "and I will make your empire the richest in the world." The promises glittered like the gold of Constantinople, 200,000 silver marks, an army of 30,000, and the reunification of the Eastern Church with Rome. In Constantinople, the Empress stood on the balcony of the imperial palace, her eyes fixed on the horizon where small black dots had begun to appear. "The Latins are coming." Panic spread through the streets. Those were not mere dots, they were hundreds of Venetian ships carrying the Crusader army. The siege lasted for months. On one decisive night, the blind Doge Dandolo, now 90 years old, ordered his men to raise his shield on the mast of the flagship. "Either I plant the banner of St. Mark on those walls today, or I die trying," he roared. The Venetian soldiers, inspired by their blind leader's courage, stormed the walls like a tidal wave. Constantinople fell on July 17, 1203. But the joy was short-lived. The young Prince Alexios, now Emperor Alexios IV, failed to gather the gold he had promised. The great city became a powder keg. In a deserted palace, Alexios V strangled the young emperor and threw his body into the Sea.By April 1204, the Crusaders had reached the point of no return. "Take what is yours," their commanders shouted. They burst into the great city like ravenous beasts. They looted Hagia Sophia, tearing the holy veil with their teeth. They stole relics of saints and loaded them onto donkeys. In the streets, the corpses of priests and monks rotted under the sun while knights drank wine from sacred chalices. Pope Innocent III, upon hearing the news of the catastrophe, collapsed in his private chamber. He had wanted to unite Christendom, instead, he had torn it apart. He had aimed to liberate Jerusalem, instead, he had lost the entire East. 20 years later, a Franciscan monk wandered through the ruined streets of Constantinople. He saw a small child playing with bones amid the rubble of a church. "What are you doing, my child?" he asked. The boy looked up with wide eyes and said, "I'm playing Crusaders." The bones in his hands were those of dead dogs. Thus ended the grand epic that had begun with a holy dream, only to conclude with the greatest betrayal. The great Constantinople was no longer what it had been, and the Crusaders were no longer heroes in anyone's eyes. The Fourth Crusade became a lesson for generations, a lesson in how greed can twist the noblest principles into excuses for the vilest crimes. In distant monasteries, monks recorded these events in their chronicles, praying for the forgiveness of those who had defiled the name of Christ under the banner of the cross. In the East, the Muslims watched in amazement as Christians turned on each other, as their enemies did to them what they could not do themselves. As for Jerusalem, the Crusades' proclaimed goal, it remained in Muslim hands, awaiting other campaigns, other wars, other victims. But one thing was certain, the world would never look at the Crusades the same way again. The Fourth Crusade had revealed the ugly face of holy wars, how religious pretexts could become mere masks for political ambitions and personal greed. In the end, no one truly won this story. Not the Pope who had wanted to unite Christendom, not the Crusaders who had sold their souls to Venice, not even the Venetians who had gained the spoils of war but lost their humanity. The only victors were those who saw the tragedy's lesson, those who understood that any war, no matter how justified, produces only ruin. And so, the Fourth Crusade became a cautionary legend, a tale mothers told their children on dark nights to remind them that evil sometimes wears the mask of virtue, and that the greatest betrayals can occur under the banners of the holiest principles, i.e. in the lavish water palaces of Venice. The golden candlelight flickered across the wrinkled faces of Venice's merchant elite as they gathered in secret council. Doge Enrico Dandolo, his blind eyes seeing more than any present, sat motionless while wealth flowed around him like the canals beneath their feet. "They've come to us like hungry sheep," one merchant sneered, his jeweled fingers tracing the rim of his wine goblet. But the aged Doge slowly shook his head. "No, like starving wolves who may turn on us if we let them grow hungrier." His sightless gaze pierced the shadows, envisioning an opportunity that wouldn't come again for centuries, the chance to make Venice undisputed mistress of the Mediterranean. Beyond the city walls, in the Crusader camp, knights argued fiercely. "The Venetians have sold us like slaves," one roared, slamming his fist on a wooden table. Count Baldwin Nye remained outwardly calm, though fury boiled within him. "What matters now is how we escape this trap." None yet realized the worst of the snare still awaited them when the massive fleet set sail from Venice. Its red and white sails filled the horizon like a floating forest. Venetian sailors sang bawdy shanties while the Crusaders contemplated their uncertain fate. Aboard one vessel, a young Flemish knight wrote in his journal, "Today we begin our holy pilgrimage, yet I feel like lambs being led to slaughter." These words would prove more prophecy than mere reflection. As Zara's walls appeared on the horizon, shame washed over the Crusaders. Priests accompanying the expedition cried out, "This is a Christian city. We cannot attack our brothers in faith." But Dandolo had calculated everything. "Pay your debts or fulfill our demands," he stated with the cold precision of a master merchant. The Crusaders looked at each other, then at their swords, and chose the path of sin over disgrace. The aftermath of Zara's fall was horrific. Women wailed over husbands' corpses, children searched rubble for their fathers, smoldering churches hung with shattered crosses. One Crusader monk recorded, "Today we lost our innocence, and shall never again be as we were." He knew they were no longer liberators of the Holy Land, but honorless mercenaries. The meeting with the deposed Prince Alexios marked the final turning point. When he offered golden promises, some Crusader leaders grew suspicious. "How can we trust a Byzantine?" they murmured. But the Venetians had prepared the ground well. "This is our chance to right our wrongs," they said cunningly. In truth, none cared about Jerusalem anymore, only gold and plunder. As the fleet approached Constantinople, even the hardest soldiers felt awe. This city had withstood Muslim onslaughts for centuries, only to now face destruction from fellow Christians. One Byzantine guard later described, "We saw the sea become a forest of masts, the sky darken with arrows. They came upon us like locusts." The final assault was a chapter from hell itself. No distinction was made between civilians and warriors, saints and sinners. 800-year-old churches were looted in hours. Constantinople's great library, containing ancient texts, burned like cheap kindling. An old woman sitting in the ruins of her burnt home whispered, "For centuries we feared the Muslims, but in the end, it was Christians who destroyed us." In the days following, the great city became a slave market. Girls from noble Byzantine families were sold as concubines. Priceless artworks were carried off to Venetian ships. Even Hagia Sophia was defiled, turned into a tavern for drunken soldiers. A Byzantine monk wrote, "If Christ returned today, he wouldn't recognize this as a Christian city." When Pope Innocent III heard the details, he took to his bed for days. "They have betrayed God," he whispered, staring at the golden cross on his wall. Now even that sacred symbol seemed nothing but shiny metal without meaning. He had discovered religion could be mere cover for human savagery unleashed. Years later, an old sailor sat in a Sicilian tavern, recounting his days in the Fourth Crusade. "We thought we fought for God," he muttered into his empty wine cup, "but we were just puppets of Venetian merchants." When a young listener asked if he regretted it, the old man's sunken eyes hardened. "Regret? No. Regret requires conscience, and we abandoned ours when we sailed from Zara." In Latin-ruled Constantinople, life moved sluggishly. Venetian merchants built new palaces while natives lived in wooden shacks. In one ruined church, a child played with bones in the rubble. "What are you doing?" his mother asked. "Playing Crusaders," he answered. The bones were from dead cats, but the child didn't know the difference. The Fourth Crusade wasn't merely history, it was a revelation of bitter truth, that men will commit any atrocity in religion's name, even betraying religion itself. It taught us brutality knows no creed, that greed wears holy masks. Most importantly, it showed some wounds never heal, some betrayals never forgive. In the end, only lessons remained. Jerusalem stayed Muslim. Constantinople lost its glory forever. Venice became a superpower for 2 centuries before withering too. But the memory of that great betrayal endures as a festering wound in Christianity's flesh, an eternal reminder that the greatest dangers come not from enemies, but from those who claim to be friends. The empire's ruin, the horrific fall of Constantinople and the opulent palaces of Venice, where the wealth of the world flowed through its watery canals. The blind Doge Enrico Dandolo sat with his advisors over a torn map of the Byzantine Empire. His gnarled fingers traced the coastline with the precision of a seasoned merchant. Here lies the fortune of the century," he whispered in his hoarse voice. The flickering candlelight cast shifting shadows across the faces of his counselors, who were beginning to understand their master's game. This was no crusade, it was a meticulously planned heist under the guise of holy war. In the Crusader camp on the city's outskirts, knights wrestled with their consciences. Count Baldwin IX sat alone in his tent, his sword resting between his hands, reflecting the lamplight. "They'd betrayed every principle," he muttered to himself, recalling how the Venetians had convinced them to attack Christian Zara. Yet an inner voice assured him the ends justified the means. Outside the tent, soldiers drank stolen wine from the cellars of the occupied city, some singing hymns while others raced horses through the rubble. When the massive fleet set sail toward Constantinople, its red and white sails filled the horizon like a floating forest. The sunburned Venetian sailors boasted of future plunder, while some Crusader monks stood silently on the decks, their eyes brimming with tears. A young man from Provence wrote in his journal, "The sea is calm today, but our hearts are stormed with doubt. Where is this journey leading us?" As the golden walls of Constantinople appeared on the horizon, an eerie silence fell over the Crusaders. Even the most hardened among them were awed by the beauty of the city that had withstood Muslim invasions for centuries. A German knight fell to his knees weeping, only for his commander to yank him up roughly. "Stand. The gold you see before you will soon be ours." The final assault was a scene from nightmares. Hagia Sophia, the jewel of Christendom, became a battleground. Drunken soldiers danced upon the altar while others pried gemstones from sacred icons with their teeth. In the imperial library, priceless manuscripts were tossed into fires to heat the invaders' tents. An old woman sat among the ruins, muttering, 800 years of civilization destroyed in a single night. Where was God? In the days that followed, the streets of Constantinople became a slave market. Girls from noble Byzantine families were sold for pennies to Eastern traders. Priceless Byzantine art was shipped to Italy on Venetian vessels, some still displayed today in St. Mark's Basilica. A Byzantine monk wrote secretly in his diary, "Today I saw Latin soldiers dragging an old woman by her hair for hiding bread." What kind of Christianity do they defend? In Rome, Pope Innocent III flew into a hysterical fit when news of the sack reached him. He threw himself to the floor of his chamber, screaming, "They have defiled the name of Christ." His servants had to wrest a pair of scissors from him, fearing he would harm himself. Yet days later, as wagons of gold arrived from Constantinople, he issued a statement blessing the triumph of faith. 20 years after the massacre, an old sailor sat in a grimy Marseille tavern, regaling young fishermen with tales of those days. "We thought we were fighting for the Lord," he said, staring into his empty cup, "but we were just thieves with holy excuses." When asked if he had seen Jerusalem, he laughed bitterly. "Jerusalem? No, but I saw hell in Constantinople." In the occupied city, now the capital of the Latin Empire, life crawled forward. Venetian merchants built lavish palaces while the native inhabitants huddled in wooden shacks. In a ruined church, a small child played with bones in the rubble. When his mother asked what he was doing, he answered innocently, "Playing Crusaders." The bones were from dead cats, but the child didn't know the difference. The Fourth Crusade was not merely a historical event, It was humanity's brutal revelation that holiness could cloak the vilest crimes. It taught us that savagery knows no creed, that greed wears the robes of piety. Most of all, it proved that some wounds never heal. In the end, only harsh lessons remained. Jerusalem stayed in Muslim hands, Constantinople lost its glory forever, and Venice rose as a superpower for 2 centuries before its own decline. But the memory of that betrayal festered like an unhealed wound upon civilization, an eternal reminder that the greatest dangers come not from sworn enemies, but from those who claim to be friends. Today, in the Vatican's secret archives, an ancient document is carefully preserved. It is a letter from the Byzantine Emperor to the Pope after the city's fall, written in shaky script with words scorched by fury: "You have betrayed us, and when the Turks come, you will find no one left to defend Christianity in the East." 250 years later, when Mehmed the Conqueror besieged Constantinople, no Western forces came to its rescue. The Fourth Crusade had finally come due, the ruin of brotherhood, an epic of betrayal that tore Christendom apart in the golden hall of the Blacherney Palace, where sunlight streamed through jewel-encrusted windows. Emperor Alexios III sat upon his ivory and gold throne. News had just arrived of the Crusaders approaching his empire's borders. "What fools these barbarians are," he muttered, polishing his signet ring with a silk sleeve. "Send them barrels of fine wine and white wheat bread, perhaps that will satisfy them." Yet his darting eyes betrayed deeper unease. He had heard stories of these so-called holy warriors, how they turned previous campaigns into pretexts for plunder. On the shores of the Bosporus, Count Baldwin IX of Flanders stared at a map of the Byzantine Empire in his lavish tent. "They refused even to receive our envoys," he roared, slamming his fist and making golden goblets tremble. A threadbare Catholic priest shook his head mournfully. "They allied with the Seljuks against us in the Third Crusade, my lord. Trust not these Greeks." The seeds of doubt had been sown, seeds that would grow into a great tree of treachery shadowing centuries of history. On Corfu one evening, where Mediterranean waves whispered secrets to the rocky shore, the exiled Prince Alexios IV gazed at the horizon where Constantinople lay. "My prince, the Crusader delegation awaits," his steward announced. Entering the hall, he faced the weary, suspicious eyes of Latin commanders. "Help me reclaim my throne," he pleaded, voice quivering, "and I shall make your empire the wealthiest in Christendom." His promises glittered like gold: 200,000 silver marks, a Byzantine army to retake Jerusalem, and the unification of churches under Rome. Meanwhile, in Hagia Sophia's cavernous nave, the Orthodox Patriarch thundered from the marble pulpit, "People of New Rome, beware wolves in sheep's clothing." Rumors swirled about the prince's pact with the Crusaders. "They use him as a pretext to seize our city," cried a silk merchant, shaking his fist. An aged nun whispered to her companion, "In my dream, angels wept upon our walls." When the Crusaders entered as allies, children strewed flowers in their path while elders watched warily. But the mood soon curdled. In the opulent Blacherney district, Latin soldiers looted goldsmith shops. "These are no liberators, they're thieves," screamed a jeweler as his life's work vanished. Emperor Alexios IV, seated at last on his longed-for throne, grew pale. "The treasury is empty," his minister confessed. "How shall I honor my pledges?" the young ruler whispered brokenly. Outside, mobs swelled daily. "Where's the gold you promised?" a Crusader knight bellowed, shaking his sword at the palace guards. One moonlit winter night, Byzantine nobles gathered in a secret cellar. "We endure this shame no longer," declared Alexios V, raising a goblet of poisoned wine. "It's them or us." By dawn, the young emperor's corpse lay in the palace garden, eyes still wide with shock. When news of the murder spread, Constantinople erupted like a tinderbox. "Treason!" roared Crusader commanders galloping through streets as women shrieked from windows. "Barbarians! Pagans!" The point of no return had been reached. On April 12, 1204, dawn stained the sky blood red. The Crusaders swarmed the walls like locusts. Inside Hagia Sophia, where golden mosaics had glowed for 8 centuries, drunken soldiers desecrated the altar. "For the Lord," one screamed, stabbing an Orthodox priest before the sanctuary. In convents, nuns wailed as they were dragged by their hair. "Where's your God now?" laughed a young soldier looting a reliquary. Weeks later, the pearl of Christendom lay in ruins. Rotting corpses fouled spring air. I saw nobles' daughters sold in slave markets, a Byzantine monk scrawled in hidden memoirs. One boasted he'd bought an aristocrat's child for a horse's price. In exile at Nicaea, Emperor Theodore Lascaris received a papal letter urging reconciliation. "We shall never forget their atrocities," he said, tearing the parchment to shreds. "They destroyed forever our trust in Christian brothers." 2.5 centuries later, as Ottomans besieged Constantinople in 1453, imperial councillors debated. "We must seek Western aid," one urged. "Better to die under Muslims than see Latins here again," another spat. The ghost of the Fourth Crusade still haunted them, thus a fragile alliance curdled into blood feud, a wound still unhealed in Christendom's flesh. As historian Nicetas Choniates wrote, had Christ been present that day, he would have denied these men as his followers. The Shattered Cross, a chronicle of greed, faith and betrayal in the Fourth Crusade. The original plan had been so pure, so noble, a holy army would sail to Egypt, the heart of Muslim power, and from there march triumphantly to reclaim Jerusalem for Christendom. Pope Innocent III had dreamed of this moment since his ascension to the papal throne. He saw himself as the architect of a new era where the cross would once more fly over the holy city. The call went out across Europe to kings and counts, to knights and commoners. All who took the cross would be granted absolution, their sins washed clean in the blood of the infidel. In the great halls of France and Flanders, nobles gathered their levies. Count Baldwin of Flanders, a man of deep piety and considerable wealth, pledged his sword. Hugh of St. Pol, his cousin, joined him with a contingent of fierce northern knights. Louis of Blois, young and eager for glory, added his forces to the growing army. Theobald of Champagne, though he would not live to see the crusade depart, had been the first to take the vow. These men and thousands like them believed in the sacred nature of their mission. They would fight for God and in doing so secure their place in heaven. Meanwhile in Venice the Serpentine canals whispered secrets of a different sort. Doge Enrico Dandolo, though nearly blind and advanced in years, possessed a vision that saw far beyond the horizon. His city built upon the waves had grown rich through trade and cunning. Now the Crusaders came to him, begging for ships to carry God's army to victory. Dandolo listened to their pleas, his face an inscrutable mask behind his milky unseeing eyes. When he spoke his voice was like dry parchment scraping against stone. "We shall build you a fleet fit for kings," he told them, "but such an undertaking requires gold, much gold." The Crusaders, eager to secure passage, agreed to his terms, not realizing the trap that had been set. The contract was signed. The price agreed upon. The Venetians would provide ships for 45,000 men and 20,000 horses along with provisions for a year. The cost would be 85,000 marks of silver, a staggering sum that would beggar even the wealthiest of lords. The Crusaders signed their names in ink while Dandolo signed his in blood, though none could see it at the time. As the months passed, the mustering points across Europe filled with men, but not nearly enough. When the time came to depart, only 12,000 had arrived in Venice, a fraction of the number promised. The coffers were empty. The Crusaders, desperate, sought audience with the Doge once more. "We cannot pay," they admitted, shame coloring their voices. Dandolo stroked his beard, his mind working behind his sightless eyes. "There is a city," he said at last, "a rebellious city called Zara. If you help us reclaim it, your debt will be forgiven." The Crusaders were aghast. Zara was a Christian city, its people followers of the cross. How could they turn their swords against their own kind? But what choice did they have? The Venetian fleet was their only means of reaching the Holy Land. Reluctantly they agreed, and so the first betrayal was born, not of Muslim blades but of Christian greed. The siege of Zara was swift and brutal. The city fell within days, its walls breached by Venetian engines, its people slaughtered or enslaved. The Crusaders walked its streets, their hands stained with the blood of those they had sworn to protect. Pope Innocent, when he heard of this atrocity, was furious. He excommunicated the Venetians, but stopped short of punishing the Crusaders themselves. The message was clear: the road to Jerusalem was paved with sin, but the ends would justify the means. It was during the grim aftermath of Zara that a new figure entered the stage, a young man with haunted eyes and a regal bearing, Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Byzantine Emperor Isaac II. He came to the Crusader camp with a tale of betrayal and a promise of gold. "Help me reclaim my throne," he begged, "and I will give you 200,000 marks of silver. I will place the Byzantine army at your command, and I will reunite the Eastern and Western churches under Rome." The offer was too tempting to refuse. The Crusaders, already mired in debt, saw in Alexios their salvation. The Venetians saw something else, an opportunity to weaken their greatest rival. The stage was set for the final betrayal. When the fleet arrived before Constantinople, even the most hardened warriors gasped at its splendor. The great walls of Theodosius Stretched for miles, the golden domes of its churches glimmered in the sun. The city seemed impregnable, a jewel set between two seas, but the Crusaders were desperate, and desperation makes men bold. The first assault failed, the defenders raining down fire and death upon the attackers, but Dandolo would not be denied. The old doge stood on the deck of his ship, his blind eyes fixed on the walls. He ordered his men to raise him up, and with a voice that belied his years he cried out, "Put me ashore, or I will leap into the sea and drown." Inspired by his madness, the Venetians redoubled their efforts, and soon the banner of St. Mark flew from the tower. Selexios was crowned co-emperor, but his reign was short-lived. The people of Constantinople despised him and his Latin allies. When he failed to produce the promised gold, the nobles conspired against him. Alexios Doukas, a man of ambition and cruelty, strangled the young prince, and threw his body into the Bosporus with their patron dead and their coffers empty. The Crusaders faced a choice: retreat in shame or take what they were owed by force. They chose the latter. The sack of Constantinople lasted 3 days and 3 nights. The Crusaders ran rampant through the streets, killing, looting, defiling. Even the Hagia Sophia was not spared, its altars shattered, its treasures stolen, its priests murdered in their own sanctuary. Women were raped in the streets, children were sold into slavery, the libraries burned, sending centuries of knowledge up in smoke. When the dust settled, the Crusaders had not taken a step toward Jerusalem. Instead, they had destroyed the greatest Christian city in the world. The Pope, when he heard the news, was said to have wept. "What have we done?" he whispered to the empty air, but it was too late for remorse. The Fourth Crusade had set out to reclaim the Holy Land. Instead, it shattered Christendom and paved the way for Islam's final victory. The Crusaders would never reach Jerusalem, but the echoes of their betrayal would reverberate through history, a cautionary tale of what happens when faith is corrupted by greed. And so the cross was shattered, not by the scimitar of the infidel, but by the hands of those who claimed to bear it in God's name. The wounds of Christendom, a harrowing tale of plague and ruin in the aftermath of conquest. The once glorious streets of Constantinople now lay in ruins, the air thick with the stench of death and despair. Where scholars and physicians once walked in flowing robes, now only shadows moved between the crumbling columns. The great hospital of the Pantocrator, its halls once filled with the hum of healing prayers, stood as a hollow shell, its stores of precious medicines plundered by foreign soldiers who knew not what they stole. In the dim light of what remained, young Dr. Nicodemos stumbled over the body of a child no more than 8 summers old, the boy's stomach swollen with hunger, his lips cracked and bleeding. The physician reached into his empty satchel, knowing he had nothing to give, no opium to ease the pain, no silphium to cleanse wounds, only his bare hands and a broken heart around him. The moans of the dying rose like a terrible chorus, men with festering sword wounds, women clutching their bellies where Crusader blades had found them, old men gasping their last breaths through lungs filled with the smoke of their burning city. The Pantocrator had been a beacon of learning where the great physician John the Archiatros had perfected the art of cataract surgery. Now its surgical tools were melted down for coin, its manuscripts used to kindle the cooking fires of invaders. In the wards where delicate procedures were once performed, rats gnawed at the fingers of corpses left unburied, the first signs of plague already showing in their twitching whiskers. Beyond the hospital's broken gates, the city told a worse tale, the forum of Theodosius, where merchants from across the world once haggled over silk and spice now hosted a different trade. Lines of shackled Greeks, their heads shaved, their eyes vacant, stood waiting to be boarded onto Venetian ships. A weeping girl no older than 14 clutched at the embroidered hem of her ruined gown, its once vibrant threads now dull with ash and blood. A Crusader knight yanked her toward the docks, his laughter echoing off the scorched walls. In the shadow of the hippodrome, the noblewoman Theodora Paleologina knelt beside the body of her husband, his skull split open by a Frank's axe. Their daughter was gone, taken in the first night of the sack, when drunken soldiers had burst through the gates of their villa. Theodora had hidden in the cistern, listening to the screams above. Now she wandered the ruins, her bare feet leaving bloody prints on the marble that had once gleamed beneath imperial processions. Near the old lighthouse, the fisherman Demetrios pulled another corpse from the Golden Horn. This one wore the robes of a priest, the man's beard had been set aflame, his hands still bound with the golden thread of a stolen chalice. Demetrios had lost count of the bodies he had dragged from the water. Each day their numbers grew, the harbor currents now carried more dead than fish. The stench hung over the city like a curse, driving the few remaining citizens to madness. In the monastery of St. John Studius, the monk Ephraim dipped his quill in ink made from soot and his own tears. He wrote of what he had seen the sisters of the convent next door throwing themselves from the cliffs rather than suffer the touch of the Latins. The children of the orphanage locked inside and burned as soldiers laughed outside the libraries set ablaze with the accumulated knowledge of centuries. His hand shook as he recorded the final words of the head librarian as the flames took him. We are not just burning parchment, we are burning the light of the world. The markets that had fed 1 million souls now stood empty, the granaries reduced to smoldering husks. Those who had survived the Initial slaughter now fell to slower deaths, their bellies swollen with hunger, their teeth loosening and falling out from the scurvy that came with living on rats and stolen wine. The rich and poor alike scrabbled in the dirt for half-rotten vegetables dropped by the Crusaders as they feasted in the Emperor's Palaceon, the once magnificent halls of the Bucolian. The Venetian Doge Enrico Dandolo sat upon a stolen throne, his blind eyes turned toward the sea. He did not see the bodies piled in the courtyards below, did not smell the gangrene creeping through the wounds of his own men. The Venetians had gotten what they wanted: control of the trade routes, the destruction of their greatest rival, but the price would be paid in blood, not theirs but that of generations to come. As the weeks turned to months, new horrors emerged. Women who had been raped now birthed babies with Frankish features. These half-foreign children were often left on the steps of ruined churches, their cries echoing through the abandoned neighborhoods. Some mothers chose a different path. The midwife Maria whispered of helping desperate women brew pennyroyal and tansy teas to purge their wombs. Others sought more permanent solutions, their bodies found hanging from olive trees in overgrown gardens. The social order that had held the empire together for 9 centuries was gone. The guilds of silk weavers and goldsmiths had been dismantled, their masters either dead or enslaved in foreign lands. The intricate laws of Justinian, that had governed every aspect of life from commerce to marriage, were trampled under the boots of illiterate soldiers. What remained was a shattered mirror of what had been in the countryside beyond the broken walls. The plague began its work. The Black Death found fertile ground in the malnourished survivors. It raced along the trade routes the Crusaders had opened, killing far more than the swords had. The very ships that carried Venetian loot back to Italy now carried pestilence to Europe. The great families that had ruled the empire for generations were wiped out, not just by violence but by the slow erosion of hope. The last Comnenoi died in a Genoese prison. The Dauca's children sold into slavery in Cairo. The Paleologui fled to Nicaea carrying only their names and their hatred. The scholars and doctors who might have rebuilt the city's knowledge were scattered to the winds, their wisdom lost in the fire and chaos. In the Hagia Sophia, where emperors had been crowned for centuries, the Latin priests performed their strange rites. The Greek faithful spat upon the floor where their ancestors had worshipped. The schism between East and West now carved in blood and fire. No amount of papal bulls would ever mend this rift. Years later, when the first Ottoman scouts appeared on the Asian shore, the people of Constantinople barely raised their heads. The Crusaders had taken everything but their lives, and now those seemed hardly worth keeping. The Fourth Crusade had set out to reclaim Jerusalem. Instead it had destroyed the last fragile thread holding East and West together. The medical knowledge of antiquity was lost, the social fabric of the Roman world unraveled. All that remained was the slow waiting for the final blow to fall. And in the ruins of the Pantocrator Hospital, the last physician, an old man who remembered the days of glory, closed the eyes of his final patient and walked into the sea, the waves washing away his tears and the memory of what Constantinople had once been. The lion's conquest, how Venice carved an empire from the ashes of Byzantium. Blind Doge stood upon the deck of his galley, the salt wind whipping his white hair as the screams of Constantinople echoed across the Golden Horn. Enrico Dandolo could not see the flames consuming the great city, but he could smell the smoke and hear the clatter of Venetian sailors hauling treasures aboard their ships. His bony fingers traced the edge of a stolen reliquary while his mind calculated far greater prizes than gold or gems. He would take lands, harbors, entire islands, the foundations of an empire that would make Venice mistress of the Mediterranean. As the Crusaders drunkenly celebrated their victory in the ruined palaces of the Byzantine emperors, the Venetians were already at work, their galleys slicing through the dawn mist toward strategic points along the coast and across the archipelago. Where others saw chaos, Dandolo saw opportunity. His agents moved like shadows through the smoldering ruins of the great city, marking warehouses, docks, and arsenals that would become Venetian possessions. His captains carried sealed orders directing them to seize not just wealth but the very mechanisms of trade and power. The first fruits of their labor came quickly. The Venetian flag was raised over the Galata quarter, its Genoese rivals driven into the sea. The massive chain that had once barred the Golden Horn now lay coiled on the docks like a defeated serpent. Soon Venetian tax collectors were extorting fees from every vessel that entered or left the harbor, their ledgers filling with the names of merchants forced to pay tribute to the Republic. To the west, along the Dalmatian coast, the city of Zara already groaned under Venetian rule, its people enslaved to repay the Crusaders' debts. But this was only the beginning. Venetian squadrons swept down the Adriatic, claiming port after port. Dubrovnik, that proud merchant city, bowed its head rather than face Venetian cannons, its leaders signing treaties that would bind them to Venetian whims for generations. The islands of Corcula and Var fell next, their fishing fleets converted to patrol vessels, their harbors transformed into naval bases in the Peloponnese. The twin fortresses of Methone and Coroni rose like stone sentinels guarding the sea lanes. Venetian engineers designed them with perfect hexagonal walls that defied both cannon fire and the desperate assaults of local lords who sought to reclaim their lands within those walls. Venetian merchants set up bustling markets where Greek produce was bought for pennies and resold at exorbitant prices to feed the starving remnants of Constantinople. The Aegean became a Venetian like the island of Euboea. With its strategic position at the heart of the archipelago, was divided into 3 baronies, but all answered ultimately to Venice. Further south, Marco Sanudo Dandolo's ambitious nephew carved out a personal duchy among the Cyclades. His ships adorned with the Lion of St. Mark patrolled the waters, extracting tolls from every vessel that dared sail without Venetian permission. But the greatest prize was Crete, the rich mountainous island that controlled the sea routes to Egypt and the Levant. Boniface of Montferrat, the nominal king of Thessalonica, found the island troublesome and was easily persuaded to sell it for a paltry sum of silver. Venetian colonists soon arrived, building towering fortresses and importing vines from home to cultivate the fertile soil. The native Greeks rebelled time and again, but Venetian reprisals were brutal. Entire villages were burned, their populations sold into slavery. The heads of rebel leaders, displayed on spikes along the harbor walls back in Constantinople, the Venetians consolidated their hold. They took the finest neighborhoods for themselves, evicting Byzantine families with cold efficiency. Orthodox churches were reconsecrated as Catholic places of worship, their icons whitewashed over, their Greek priests replaced by Latin clergy. The great cisterns and aqueducts that had sustained the city now served Venetian households first, while Greek quarters went thirsty. The Venetian arsenal back home worked day and night, producing new ships to protect these far flung possessions. Each vessel carried not just soldiers but bureaucrats, tax collectors, and spies. The Republic's insatiable appetite for control demanded meticulous records. Every bolt of silk, every amphora of oil, every slave taken in their new territories was catalogued and taxed. As years turned to decades, the Venetian Empire became a vast machine fueled by greed and discipline. The old Byzantine trade routes now bent to Venetian, while the spices of Alexandria, the silks of Persia, the furs of Russia, all flowed through Venetian hands, their value multiplied tenfold. Before reaching European markets, the once great Byzantine merchant families were reduced to poverty, their ships rotting in neglected harbors, their knowledge of Eastern markets dismissed as obsolete. Yet even as Venice celebrated its ascendancy, the seeds of its eventual decline were being sown in Nicaea. The exiled Byzantine court plotted their return, their hatred of Venice burning brighter than ever. The Greek peasants who tilled Venetian fields whispered prayers for deliverance. The Turks, watching from across the Bosphorus, took note of Venetian defenses and weaknesses, and high in the Venetian Doge's palace the aging rulers of the Republic pored over maps dotted with lion banners. They did not see the resentment brewing beneath their feet, the exhaustion of overstretched resources, the slow crumbling of their merciless efficiency. They saw only an empire that stretched from the Alps to the Levant, and they called it good. But empires built on the bones of others rarely endure. The Venetian century would pass as all empires pass, not with a bang but with the slow quiet leaking away of power. The Ottomans would take Constantinople in 1453, the Portuguese would find new sea routes to India, the world would change and Venice would be left with empty coffers and fading glory. Yet for that brief shining moment after the Fourth Crusade, Venice stood astride the Mediterranean like a colossus, its merchants princes, its navy invincible, its will absolute. The blind Doge had seen farther than any of them. He had taken not just gold but the very mechanisms of power, and for a time it had been enough.